In many ways, we are now returning to the place where our first session, the political agenda. The session is called, the Nordic Perspectives, what are the realistic political solutions? And to share this session, we have Kjetil Larsen, and he's a professor in law for the Norwegian Center for Human Rights at the University of Oslo. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience for staying until the very end of the program. In this final session of the day, we will hear from the practitioners. We will hear comments and reflections to what we've heard earlier today from three central organizations working with migration issues in the field, namely the International Organization for Migration, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Norwegian Organization for Asylum Seekers. And our key question for this panel is whether the perspectives and descriptions we've heard from the researchers earlier today are relevant for those who work in the field with these issues on a daily basis. Does the academic description of the realities correspond to realities as seen on the ground? Do the academic suggestions provide realistic guidance to current challenges? Martin Wyss said before the break that academics have a tendency to look at trees and not the forest. So let's then hear from the forest wardens. To take us through this panel, we have on the far left Prytz, who is head of regional representation for Northern Europe at the UNHCR based in Stockholm in Sweden. We have in the middle Ann-Magrit Austenå, who is Secretary General at the Norwegian Organization for Asylum Seekers. And at my near left, Martin Wyss, who is Chief of Mission at IOM in Netherlands. They will give short presentations. We'll start with you, Pia. The floor is yours.
Do I sit or stand?
As you wish.
Maybe. You know, it's always like this. You sit at home and you think, okay, let me try and prepare for this. And then you arrive and then you get so inspired by so many fantastic speakers. It's been a privilege for me. It's not often that I have time to spend a whole day listening to so many fantastic presentations in this area, which I think, without a doubt, as has been repeated, is one of the most important topics of our times. And suddenly, when I look at our region, one of the most, if not the most important topic for all our governments. It goes apparently before health, work, and many, many other things that normally would be preoccupying people's minds. And you said, from a Nordic perspective, is there something we can do? Well, I would like to end the presentation by looking into the future and propose a way forward. But as many of you have touched upon, no, let me put it this way. When I took up my post in November 2011, I said we need to have a vision. We need to have a vision for this region, and the vision has to be this region will be the region of excellence. Why? Because we can afford to be, because there is a long-term commitment to human rights and refugee protection, and because we have functioning asylum systems, etc., etc. So let's make sure that we use the Nordic region or the Northern European region as a region that will inspire the rest of the world. And we will do things in this region that will inspire UNHCR operations elsewhere. I still want it to be a region of excellence. I have not given up hope. But what we have seen in the space of a very short time span is that countries that normally would be considered utterly unsafe, and from which there were an assumption that if people left, they were indeed in need of protection, are now being interpreted to, well, maybe some or bigger areas of those countries would be safe, and maybe there are possibilities. And criteria, the refugee criteria in a way being watered down with recognition rates for Iraqi, Afghans and Somalis, Eritreans, way up in the 80s, just in 2014-15. Now, all of a sudden, we see recognition rates that are between 20 and 40%. And it differs between our countries. The reception conditions are deliberately made less attractive. The use of detention has been introduced where it never was before. And the possibilities to unite with your family member is increasingly being restricted, something that one would have thought would be a holy cow and something that nobody would dare to touch because we understand that family is the cornerstone of the whole fabric of our society. And the results we are seeing, including the results from a system that didn't work in Europe last year, was that no state lived up to their obligations, including in the Nordics. People were allowed to move through Denmark to Sweden. People moved on from Sweden to Finland and Norway. And now, with all these restrictions, what we are seeing is that there is, even within the region, a bit of shopping. So Iraqis are moving on from Sweden to Finland. Afghans are moving from Sweden and Norway to Iceland. So we are not actually in a situation where we can say that we are finding any kind of solutions as it is. One of the things I've heard, which makes me very happy, from the many speakers, is that what we need is a common system. Now, that is a good starting point, because if all academics can agree that the way to go, internal and close ourselves in behind big fences is not the way, and that we can agree that something should become common, that's very important. And on a real positive note, with all this happening in our neighborhood, with all people being scared because there was indeed, and I think this was discussed, the numbers weren't that big. No, but it is scary when things are not managed. It's scary when people are just coming in. It's scary when you look at the television and you don't know how to react because are they coming? Was the feeling that we got into our living rooms, and how are we going to deal with that? But in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed in September. And while refugees and asylum seekers and stateless, which we should not forget in this discourse, are not mentioned under each of the goals and all the action points, it's in the preamble. And the core thing that I think we should hold on to there is that it clearly declares that we should globally leave no one behind. This has never been said before. Previous development goals were something that happened out there, but these development goals, these sustainable development goals, are obliging all countries in the world, including ours. The second thing was the World Humanitarian Summit that was held, which further enhanced the commitment to ensure that we globally hold ourselves responsible through including providing the necessary funding to the many situations that we have. And last but not least, with the New York Declaration, and that was adopted on the 19th of September by 193 member states of the United Nations, which was, in our opinion, once in a lifetime chance for refugees because it's people-centered. It starts with people. And UNHCR hope that this will revolutionize the way that the international community engages with refugees. And for those who are still a little bit skeptic, Thomas, when the Universal Declaration was drafted in 1948, everybody thought this is the sky in the pie, this is the pipe dream, it's never going to happen. But now we are holding ourselves to those standards. And what the UN New York Declaration did is that it affirmed strongly the validity of the 1951 Convention, international human rights and humanitarian law. And this in the context of a global, of our little discussions here in this part of the world that also takes place in many, many other countries. And with it, there is a comprehensive refugee response framework that contains many of the practices that we have been involved with in decades, but there are also new things. For instance, a focus on refugees and host communities, the fact that development actors have to come in much earlier, the fact that international financial institutions have to come in much earlier, and the fact that it's not just a piecemeal approach to health, education, or host community support, but actually requires a comprehensive, all-of-society approach. So I wanted to say this because I, like you, Victis, believe that if you work in our field, you have to be an optimist. So, because if we are not, we're giving up in advance. And the challenges are simply too great not to start to tackle them, and we can. Now, that is now these different packages we heard about earlier today. The first EU asylum package, which included the Dublin, and the second package that is looking at the other directives that you mentioned will be turned into regulations, Jens. So I'm not going to go into that, but maybe what I feel like doing, and that's the change I made, is that UNHCR is going to come out. It's not out yet. I don't have a justice ministry that's telling me so you can't say anything, because some of these elements, of course, I will be very happy to share with you, but on the understanding that this is very broad strokes of thinking that's being elaborated, but they're coming out very soon. And it will contain a number of guiding, principles and some proposals on the way forward. One of the things that I've heard very much from you today affirms the need, I think, to strengthen the European asylum system, to take on a much, much stronger monitoring role in terms of ensuring that the approaches and the application of the legal standards and norms are harmonized across all countries in Europe. The second is to strengthen the role of the new Frontex, which is also being elaborated, to monitor that fundamental human rights are adhered to at the borders of the EU, to ensure that nobody is forced back in breach of the principle of non-refoulement. There has been relocation, and what I've heard from you, and which we all know, it has been too slow. It has not really been working very well. We are very far from the 160,000 that supposedly should be distributed before the end of next year. And what did the relocation do? Well, relocation is about distributing asylum seekers. Basically saying, we have asylum seekers that are coming in, Dublin is not working, so we will distribute, so everybody will relocate those that have a possibility to be recognized, and that is anybody where the recognition rate is around 75%. What if we said that we would have European processing centers in all our countries, so that wherever you arrived, you would be processed? Because what is the fear out there? The fear is that we don't know who is coming. They're not registered anywhere. Nobody's doing any security checks. How can we trust the systems? People are just moving on. What if those centers were registering on a standardized basis in databases that correspond to each other, are being security checked wherever they are? And what if at that stage there was a very quick identification of those who may have family members elsewhere. One of the biggest reasons why people are moving from country to country is because they try and get where they have a link, a family member. And yes, the Dublin regulation is expanding the family criteria. This is good, but we think it should be much broader. So you actually, before you do anything else, you've done your check, your security check. I'm simplifying this a lot. You'll get a much more sophisticated paper in due course. You distribute, you let people move regularly so that a family unit's claim is dealt with in one state and together. This could also be much more useful when it comes to returns. Those that are manifestly well-founded, meaning fast-tracked, yes, chances are you're a refugee, will recognize you quickly, will remain in the country where they are up to a certain point of some kind of distribution key that probably many of you know already is being discussed at the European level. And those that are manifestly unfounded are dealt with and returned from the country where they are. And if you start to have a surplus, if you start to get some countries that get more than others, then you could start to look at distributing also asylum seekers, but only then.
I'm afraid I need to ask for concluding.
And with that, I am enticing you to think a bit outside the box. I'm welcoming some of the proposals of the involvement of NGOs and the voluntary sector. I think if we want to make things work, we need an all-of-society approach.
Thank you. Martin, next one up.
Are you sure?
According to the program.
Aha, sorry. I thought I would be through. Okay. I'll be brief. I'm not sure why I was invited. Why IOM was invited, because it's not a complete joke, but if you look at this picture, these are probably refugees, asylum seekers, about which we've spent the day discussing, is it right, should they be stopped, are we fair, etc. Well, our organization is called International Organization for Migrations, and as we know, UNHCR is responsible, very clearly responsible for refugees. And the people that we think we are responsible for and for whose rights we engage are in this sense not represented. But the reality is such that there are, I hate to use the word because it's been overused, there are these mixed flows. But they do have consequences on our work and on politics and on policies. Let's start with returns. I mean, in order to make it smaller and less of an issue, it would be nice if there wouldn't have been a need for return so many. I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, of course, for a number of reasons, but this is a chart showing the last year's return close to 70,000. Interestingly enough, there are 12,000 back to Albania, 10,000 back to Kosovo, and close to 7,000 back to Serbia. I'm not sure if these are the same people we see on this picture. However...
From where? From where? From all over Europe?
Yes, yes. I mean, they weren't returned from Ethiopia. They were returned from, from where
from
they
the
were returned. The Nordics, they also play a very small number, you can guess. Top country would be Germany, followed by Austria, Belgium. Greece is still high, was much higher last year, but there was a problem with EU funding last year. Netherlands, and then Norway at the very end from the top 10. And this is all on our website and public. But the reason, the point I'm trying to make is, of course, that because I'm not going to import Dutch political discussions here to the far north, but I can imagine that the discussions are similar because the Dutch approach to asylum and migration is similar. By the way, I'm from the far south of the north. I'm from Switzerland originally, and that's where the north begins in terms of how asylum is viewed and how asylum is a value that needs to be protected. Now, we've heard several times today that on the 19th of September there was a summit in New York, and the decision was to have two compacts, one for refugees and one for migration. And I believe, as was said by the Prime Minister and many others, that it's time that we start to make a bit of a difference. And it's very clear, it has also been said by many, that if we manage to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, we will be able and empowered to do a much better job for those running away from the scene we have on the picture. But we live in a time of paradoxes, and I just list very few. The first one I've mentioned, these huge numbers of returnees from clearly EU candidate countries, safe countries, and countries which benefit from visa freedom. It's not clear to me why a priori they should all be tracked through the asylum system. We just heard from Pia that UNHCR is also in favor of a much quicker processing system which would unburden the system. Our Director General has nice quotes, and one of them is that migration is inevitable, necessary and beneficial if well managed. IOM knows a lot about managing migration because we actually started as a resettlement organization after the Second World War, and we still are, I think, the world's leader in resettlement, and we do it. In the Netherlands, we have a big airport called Schiphol in Amsterdam. We process roughly 10,000 migrants per year there, around 1,000 coming to the Netherlands in the context of relocation and resettlement, about 2,000 to 3,000 returns, and 6,000 to 7,000 transiting to other destinations on resettlement. So altogether, it's 8,000 or 7,500 resettlement, including a little bit of relocation. The Netherlands does better than other European countries, and the rest is return, but small return. Now, why do I mention resettlement? It's not only important as a concept, but it also means managed migration because we also then book tickets, there is a pre-departure counseling, preparation, cultural orientation, but everybody leaves with a dossier, with a file, including medical tests, etc. And before that file is complete, nobody gets a ticket. That's the normal procedure. Before you have visas, and there are more and more visas, restrictions, you cannot travel. Second contradiction and paradox is the smuggling and what happens in the Mediterranean. Just a provocative question. When Angela Merkel, a little bit more than a year ago, clearly signaled that the way was free for Syrians running away from Aleppo and that they would get asylum in Germany, and I think other Nordic countries did the same, how exactly did we expect these people to arrive here without the smugglers? They had to use. So what are all these conferences hammering the smugglers and fighting and criminalizing something which clearly is a missing link in the normal asylum system as illustrated below? Since I have to conclude, and I would have loved, as you already know, to continue with a bunch of other issues which are directly relevant to discussion, it's clear we have to somehow find a way to reformulate globally the management of migration. It's still not clear how we can have en parallel a system with resettlement, relocation, but also all sorts of other, from green cards to family unification, which requires you to fill out forms, to pass the tests, to be interviewed before you leave, before you arrive, not as a refugee, but as a new citizen, as was the case in Canada recently, taking in 2,500 and soon more. And en parallel, we have all this, I'm very happy it was mentioned today, chaotic situation, which seems uncontrollable and ungovernable, and therefore provokes all sorts of nasty discourses which politicians try to fight back against by showing that they are in control again, which Angela Merkel did again by visiting Niger, which is the new hotspot. And what the whole, just a quick glance to the future, I think what's going to happen is that instead of the processing taking place here in Norway or in the Netherlands, much more processing will take place in hotspots such as Agadez in Niger, a country many would have confused with Nigeria, couldn't find on the map, which is now, you can Google it, is now an important place. The same is true for the other Maghreb. Very last sentence, I heard that wasn't a natural cough. Look, we don't just, we really need, I want to finish with a human story, very brief human story. It's clear that the willingness for more resettlement is largely reduced because there's so much uncontrolled migration, which then is abused by populists, number one. There's also no willingness for regular labor migration for a number of reasons. Although there are very good examples. I worked 7 years in Moldova, and some of my key partners in the government, they managed to survive and do extremely important work for the government, by the way, the Ministry of Social Protection, because they were allowed to come to Norway and work in a salmon factory during the summer holidays. Now, recently, this has been changed and taken away. And despite the fact that it was the perfect example of seasonal, temporary, and circular migration. It's, again, something, there's conferences in Brussels and in other places, but nobody really knows how to deal with it. So I plead for clearer definitions and clearer, more evidence-based policies, which would then open, hopefully, the way for more openness towards migrants and asylum seekers, by the way.
Thank you.
That was 5 minutes.
And finally, Ann-Magrit, Austenå.
It's late in the day. I'll try to be brief. Pia has said what's needed to be said about the needs of a common European approach and a common way to deal with asylum seekers. I'd like to go back home to the Nordic countries, and the least we can do is to keep our promises and our pledges and to relocate from Greece and Italy, and Greece mainly, and to do resettlement. There is a desperate need of more resettlements from Turkey, and the EU-Turkey statement is absolutely not working, and the situation for a lot of people in the islands and on the mainland in Greece is that a lot of Syrians, Iraqis and Afghanis are actually held hostage. They're not dealt with, but because if they were dealt with, that would be the wrong signal. That wouldn't be the signal that everybody that reached Greece after 20th of March would be returned to Turkey. Then there would be the signal that there is actually a way to be treated as an asylum seeker and to be dealt with. So this is an extremely cynical part of what is now called European policy on asylum. And in Turkey, because of what's happening after the failed coup, there is hardly any reporters reporting on what's happening, and we know little. But what is going on is that they're building a concrete wall, a border wall to Syria, 200 kilometers is finished. They're planning another part of 400 kilometers and then another on 800 kilometers. And they're now working on legislation that will open up to give citizenship to 300,000 of the best qualified Syrian refugees in Turkey. These are not allowed to be resettled in Europe. Turkey wants to keep them and to transfer those that need more help and assistance. So this is the kind of cynical treatment of persons that can be addressed from the Nordic countries, that can be challenged, and I hope that also people in my former profession, the media, will try to expose more what's actually going on. And then there is a huge need for investment in the neighboring area. The Nordic countries could do that. There is a need for economic development. If there is any way, any hope of absorbing refugees into the workforce, there has to be an economic development. Somebody has to make that happen. And then our home governments has to stop the double talking that's now going on. This is my last point. They cannot go to the UN and talk about the common international responsibility towards the convention and to international law, and then work back home in their ministries to undermine the convention and to have discreet talks with other Nordic countries and others on what parts of the convention that can be attacked and challenged by more than one country. And they cannot talk of a common European approach while competing Norway and Denmark, especially, of being the strictest one, of having the least number of asylum seekers and take the least numbers of refugees. And they cannot, like you were saying, attack the smugglers and then not having any legal safe pathways for those that actually needs protection to come out of the area where they are. And they have to stop the criminalization of migration, the criminal migration language, which is used to give a flair of necessity to use detention of children, detention of families. It's a disgrace for the Nordic country. It's a disgrace for Norway, and it has to stop. It has to be challenged. Thank you.
Thank you to you all. Small token on behalf of the organizers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tusen tack. Supert. Ta mig på ytan.
Thank you very much. It is Friday afternoon, so we move into cafe mode. Because to take us into the weekend, we have invited two political commentators, namely Magnus Takvam from Norwegian broadcaster NRK, and Amalie Kestler from the Danish newspaper Politiken. We asked them simply whether the solutions presented by the researchers today are feasible and realistic given the current political context in Nordic countries. You have 15 minutes. But let's start with the open-ended question. What is, in your view, the political climate in the field of refugee and migration in Denmark and Norway at the moment?
First, I would like to say it's been really interesting to listen to all of these talks today. And the final speaker, Ann-Magrit, I have to disappoint you, I think, because what you were hoping for at last is not, at the moment at least, the way things are going in Denmark. I did a small calculation before, and I think we have 30, maybe 40 politicians in the Danish parliament who represent parties whose main focus in this debate is international solutions, where they are welcoming or talking about Denmark has to make a bigger contribution. And that is top 40 out of 179 members of the Danish parliament. So that's a rather small group, and the Danish People's Party is 37 members of parliament, just to put that into perspective. So we have a situation in Denmark now where the current government went to election in 2015 with an immediate stop as one of their election slogans, an immediate stop for any foreigners coming into the country, more or less. They have come forward with restrictive politics more and more. And now we have 4 or 5 right-wing conservative parties and a new one just trying to get into the next election, and it looks like they are gonna get in. The opinion polls are always shady, but it looks like it. And they have an even more restrictive policy on this area. So that's kind of the situation in Denmark at the moment.
Yes, the audience here is mainly Norwegian, I suppose, so they are more familiar with the situation in Norway than in Denmark. But in general terms, I would say that the political spectrum, so to speak, has moved in Norway towards a more restrictive line in general over the last years. At the moment, today, the topics which you have been discussed are not on the political agenda, so to speak, at all. It does all move under the radar of the media and the public debate. And that's the cynical reason for that has been touched upon by some of the speakers, of course. The domestic political scene. We have an election in Norway in 11 months, and after last year's, so to speak, explosion of discussion and tension over the refugee issue, there is only one political party which is in favor of having this on the agenda. As you all understand, the Progress Party, one of the 2 parties in the minority government. And I have spoken to representatives of other parties in the parliament who are politically liberal on this issue, but they also say that we don't want to follow up when the Progress Party is launching their policies, because we are not interested in having that debate going on now, because we lose voters. And they want to launch other issues, inequality, labor issues, green policies, and so on. So that's the situation just today, to be short.
But why do you think politicians in Norway and Denmark continue to use the crisis narrative? Just to take one example, in the last legislative restrictions package in Norway, the so-called Innstramninger 2, when that was sent out for public hearing, there was a massive refugee flow to Norway, and that was used as the justification for the restrictions. By the time the bill was sent to Parliament, the refugee flow had completely dried out, and then they still used the crisis narrative for future possibilities of refugee flows. So it maintained the crisis narrative, even if it had slowed down. But why?
Well, if we analyze the Progress Party and their motives, as I mentioned, they that's the party which has an interest in having this agenda on immigration constantly there. And they also want to fuel the uncertainty of what is going to happen. They want to have this idea in their electorate that something terrible might happen. So they always point to this insecurity. There's a ticking bomb, so to speak, out there. In Africa, there are economic migrants who are in some days maybe willing to come to, they are planning to come to us, and so on. So that's their reason for using this crisis, the crisis word, or this spread this idea. I think that one aspect of this debate is you can use last year as an example. If the public conceives what is happening as a humanitarian crisis, that trigger other sentiments than if the public conceives what is happening as illegal immigration. And there was a big shift in the opinion, both in Norway and in other countries, when the focus on the Mediterranean crisis and so on shifted onto the refugee crisis. And there was how do you conceive this crisis as you describe it today as a mainly mainly crisis? But many in the Norwegian electorate do not agree on that issue, and that's one of the reasons why the restrictive parties have support both in Norway and other countries.
Yeah, I think that's true for Denmark as well. And my experience is that politicians talk about crisis when they either want to manage a crisis or when they want to make it unmanageable. So either they talk about a crisis because they can go out and say we solved this crisis, economic or job-wise or whatever, or they talk about a crisis when they want to show that they are not responsible, that they want to broaden the responsibility. So saying this is not something that we can do alone. At the same time, it's interesting in this concrete situation that Denmark is, for example, sending people back on the Dublin or away from Denmark on the Dublin agreement, and then at the same time we're not part of the common European asylum system. So we're in a way just wanting others to take care of the problem. I read in an interview with the Danish commissioner to the EU, Margrethe, who said that when the common European asylum system is on the agenda in the EU Commission, beside Denmark, it just says NA, not available. And this to me is kind of a symbol of Denmark in this debate. We're not really available for that much at the moment. And this goes also the fact that we stopped taking quota refugees, which was, by the way, supported by the Social Democratic Party. So that kind of shows you the political climate at the moment.
Erna Solberg opened today by saying that no state can overcome the refugee crisis by building walls. And then thought that that's funny because that's precisely what we're doing, literally speaking, at the border against Russia, but also more figuratively speaking, that we are in a sense trying to build walls. It's a policy of deterrence. Keep people out. If they come in, let's detain them, send them out as quickly as possible. Do words match actions? Is there a genuine sense of the need for international cooperation, or is this all states for themselves kind of policy?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer in a few words, but I think Erna Solberg can say what she says without protest, actually, at the moment in Norway. Because I think, as I hinted to, that there is no one opposing the present, so to speak, practice on this on the immigration and asylum policies, and everyone is, to be honest, hoping that we will not have a repetition of last year, because the political system didn't fix it. Also, the liberal parties in this field, yes. So that's my analysis of it. Anyway, yes.
Well, I think one of the former speakers talked about double talk. We just had a story in Politiken about a month ago that documented that our foreign minister and our minister of integration speak quite different languages when it comes to this subject. Our foreign minister went to the UN and talked about the respect for human rights and the treaties and international conventions and everything. And our Minister of Integration repeatedly talks about challenging international treaties and conventions. So we have a situation where you have kind of a domestic communication to the electorate, and then an international for kind of nicer events globally. And to be honest, I think the positive thing is that Denmark, on a global scale, is saying we stand by the conventions, and the government actually, before it came into government, the prime minister, who's now the prime minister, talked about challenging the convention, and he's not talking about that anymore. But it's the idea is still very much out there, and these different right-wing parties that we have talk about it a lot. And I just read last night that actually this is also politics for the Social Democratic Youth Party in Denmark. They want to challenge the conventions as well.
Well, one point which I think is important to reflect on is why are the populist parties so strong? One might discuss what kind of populist parties. They differ, of course, in the different countries. The Norwegian Progress Party is more moderate than, of course, the Swedish Sverigedemokraterna and so on. But I think one reflection which both the mainstream parties have to do, and also the people who represent institutions in Europe and elsewhere, have to consider that their strength is a relative strength. They are strong and growing because the mainstream political parties and the other institutions which I mentioned, also the political institutions in the EU, for instance, have demonstrated their weakness, and that they have not been able to meet the concerns of their electorate and in the different countries. And I feel that the political spectrum, other than these populist parties, are seeking solutions without finding them. They shadow, sometimes, for instance, the Social Democratic Party in Denmark is more or less adopting the policies of Danish People's Party. And the Norwegian Labour Party, which has to balance, because its electorate is spread all over the spectrum in the liberal restrictive axis, they are very going very lightly on this issue. So I think this is a challenge for the other parties, and they have not, in my opinion, done a good enough job in that respect.
Thank you. I'm afraid that that's all the time we have, because all good cafes have live entertainment on Friday afternoons. So do we. We want to give Thomas Gammeltoft-Hansen again the chance to provide some comments to the proceedings today. So you may join the audience again. Thank you very much for your reflections.
And I see I have exactly 5 minutes. Is that correct, Kjetil?
On the spot.
On the spot. Well, thank you very much. And indeed, thanks to all of you for providing a very, very stimulant discussion all through today. Unlike what I might have been perceived as, I am indeed optimistic about certain things, both in terms of policy. I do think there's a lot of different things out there that's pointing the way forward. But I think more fundamentally, I'm also optimistic in other ways, and I would like to highlight 3 of them in this sort of round-off. I think I'm quite optimistic in the sense that we've seen today and elsewhere a really coming together and trying to link different issues, seeing and understanding the intimate relationship between formally different issue areas, from global responsibility sharing to local integration in municipalities, from migrants to refugees, from root causes to return of failed asylum seekers. And this is very much needed if we are to sort of talk about relevant solutions and find ways forward. Secondly, and equally important, I think we've seen the coming together of different disciplinary perspectives, which is also deeply needed. Looking at the kind of different research fields that I think at least the research here represents, it's clear that we've been historically constituted by quite different disciplines along the different fields. If you look at refugee studies, it's been dominated historically by lawyers and ethnographers, with relatively few economists and some sociologists who have conversely really helped drive and set the frame for migration studies, on the other hand. So I'm quite pleased to see these silos sort of starting to break up and give way to more engagements, also institutionally. I think the logos we have here are quite significant of this. This is the inaugural event of the Nordic Institute for Migration and Refugee Research, but the fact that it's all co-organized this event very nicely with Fafo and with the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, I think really shows that coming together of quite different sets and portfolios of expertise in that sense. Last but not least, I've been quite pleased to see this discussion across the kind of academic practitioner divides. I think it's quite daring to end up by asking the last 3 panelists whether they thought what they heard today was actually relevant. I think fortunately, none of you were so impolite as to simply say no. Though I think Martin made a strong point in terms of also sort of really broadening the focus here. More fundamentally, I think this is a two-way road. I think we've seen very rich comments and remarks, not just from this last panel and from the commentators we had on for the end session, but also throughout the day from all of you, practitioners, the politicians, others, who are really providing quite thought-provoking knowledge, nuancing our understanding, changing our perspective, pointing things in the right direction. So very, very rich conversation. And more fundamentally, I think there is a particular moment of opportunity right now for engaging in more policy-oriented research. If my and others' diagnosis this morning is correct, for the first time in years, there is a real appetite among policymakers, practitioners, for really getting more research, deeper understandings, and finding new ideas. But of course, this also puts an onus on us as researchers to ensure that such input and policy proposals are based on solid, comprehensive, unbiased research, and dares move into the, for some academics at least, sometimes uncomfortable space of engaging in a mutual dialogue with a view to advancing constructive ideas and not simply launching critique. And that brings me full circle, because this obviously points back to the previous steps of issue linkage and cross-disciplinarity. And I'd like to congratulate the organizers of this conference because I think this event managed to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And to close the session, the person who is affiliated with all of the three organizers, Vigdis Wevstad.
Thank you, Kjetil. Yes, in fact, I've been sitting looking and thinking I'm extremely privileged to have a link up to all of these organizations. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I fully endorse everything that you, Thomas, was saying in summing up here. This cross-fertilization of interdisciplinary cooperation, networking, international cooperation at all levels. I think it has really been a very, very enriching and rewarding day, and I think we're not going to stay long now. We're going to say bon voyage, we're going to say have a happy journey home. But before that, it is also my pleasure to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who has contributed to this day. Thank you to also those that we have not seen, those who are backstage, who are perhaps among the most important, who haven't shown their faces except for in and out quickly. Thank you to you in the audience for having been so active and for having shown such sustainability. It has been really wonderful, and I thank you all. And I think it's rather funny when some of my colleagues are saying thank you to the organizers. You are actually organizers. Thomas, Kjetil, and the others from NIM also. Thank you very much, everybody. And I also have the pleasure of handing out some gifts. Before I do that, let me explain, because it's very unclear to our Nordic colleagues what they are for. I have been asked if it's a tablecloth, if it's something to hang on the wall. This is something you sit on to keep warm when you're out hiking. Thank you very much, everyone.